A lot of people would ask a lot of questions of us. A lot of the questions we might be asked is, how do we know truth? And is there any such thing as truth in our world today? Or is truth always just a matter of perspective? There was a young lady who started a business. She was shrewd, she was diligent, she worked hard, and business started to grow, and she realized that in her business she would soon need some in-house counsel from a lawyer. She started to interview applicants, and there was one young man who sat across from her. And she said to him, as I'm sure you can understand, in a business like this, personal integrity must be beyond question. And she leaned forward and said, so are you an honest lawyer? Honest? Let me tell you about how honest I am. I am so honest that my dad lent me $15,000 for my education. And I paid back every penny the minute I tried my very first case. That's impressive. So what sort of case was it? Well, my dad sued me to get the money back. Yeah, truth. It's an attempt. Is truth difficult to discern? Is everything always black and white? Or are things always shaded gray? Can we know truth? And it's a challenging question in this day and age. I'm going to do something very different in that I don't think I've ever done anything quite like this, in that I'm going to take a second attempt at a sermon series. A few years ago I did a sermon series that answered some of the tough questions that are being asked of Christianity in the 21st century. Some of the questions that are very difficult. Is there just one way to God? Are science and Christianity compatible? How do we live morally without being like the Pharisees? And maybe a struggle that a lot of people ask, that we're going to ask in a couple of weeks, how can there be suffering if God is a God of love? And finally, in our next communion service, which is going to be in February, we usually do communion the first Sunday of the month. We did it last week. It's kind of a nice thing to do for year-end, year beginning. So we did communion last week. In February, when we do our communion service, we're going to ask the question, does the cross, this place of immense suffering and cruelty, does it really fix anything? So we're going to tackle some difficult questions that are asked of the church. And then when we're done that, we're going to go into some more traditional stuff. We're going to look at the Gospel of Mark. There are many attacks against the church these days. And some who make an argument that belief in God is a dangerous thing. We can run across writers, speakers who've gotten some notoriety and appear in the media a lot, who make the argument that we need to ridicule and educate people away from any sort of belief in God. We need to take it out of our society altogether. We tackled this sermon series last time. I tackled a whole lot of questions. We saw that Christianity, despite the arguments of some, is actually growing, not shrinking. That history shows that religious belief is actually not a dangerous thing, but has been a great benefit to society. That science's very roots are found in the church. And that the Bible, this holy book we look at, is fully reliable and can be trusted. We're going to tackle a couple other things in this sermon series. But these are 5 questions that we're going to look at over the next 5 weeks that the church is struggling with right now because the world is throwing it in our face. And the world is saying to us, how can you answer these questions? How can Christianity be true if we've got these 5 questions, they don't seem right. So we're going to tackle this today. Is there only one way to the Father? Is there only one source of truth? Is there only one source of truth? So we're going to look at some arguments. One of the biggest problems that a lot of people have with Christianity is its claim to be exclusive. First little bit of this sermon today, I'm going to take directly from a book, or at least some of the questions that are asked, from a gentleman by the name of Timothy Keller, who's a pastor in New York, who wrote a book about, is it reasonable to believe in God in this day and age? And he's pastoring in New York City. Now, New York City is a little different than Viking, you may have noticed. Not only is it a lot bigger, they like to ask a lot of questions. And he talked about opportunity. I've never had an opportunity like that. I would love to have this as an opportunity. But he was invited by a local college to come and speak alongside a Jewish rabbi and a Muslim imam, teacher for their faith. And they sat down in front of this audience, and they had a discussion about what are some of the basic tenets of their faith. And as each one, in a very friendly, nice way, talked about the basic tenets of their faith, it became evident that each of the 3 religions that were being talked about there were incompatible with one another. There is not a way that you can say that Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are all just different ways of talking about the same thing. And they had a nice discussion. It was very friendly. It was an academic-type discussion. And then at the end, it was opened up to the college audience to ask questions. And this pastor said the tone of the questions shocked him. He said that the discussion between these 3 different groups was very friendly, but people were quite upset. And what they were upset with was this. How can any of you come and just say you're right? How can any of you make this claim that you are the exclusive way of truth? How can any of you claim to know the truth at all? I was disturbed by that, and sometimes I am as well. Because the base of the argument is this: there can be no peace in our world if we do not all hold the exact same belief about God. That's the crux of the argument. If we do not all believe the exact same thing, then we're never going to get along with each other. I would take that further. I mean, if you're going to argue that, you need to argue that we need to have the exact same view on economics, because there's been wars fought on that. Politics. We'll never agree on politics. Language, culture, history. Maybe all, in everything. We need to always believe the exact same thing in all ways about all subjects if you take that argument to its logical end. We all must believe the same thing about all things if you accept that reason. I will be the first to admit that if Christianity comes up and claims, as Jesus claims, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and Jesus makes that claim, we are claiming exclusivity, and there is danger in that. I do not accept that Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism are other ways to God. And there is danger in claiming that to peace, I admit it. But I also believe that I have a responsibility as a Christian to love and not hate anyone else. to know and to understand others. We've had in this pulpit before Harold Clausen, who works in Edmonton with immigrants, particularly Muslims. He's worked previously in Indonesia. Now he's working in Edmonton, and he's got this Palm ministry. A couple of us went up there and worked with him for a week a few years ago. And in Palm Ministries, they work with these immigrants, helping them to understand the language and the culture they're moving into, help them with banking, help them fill out government forms, all these things that have to be done that are foreign to them. They serve them. A Christian ministry that is serving the Islamic community. I think that's the model that Jesus gives us. You want to know how we counteract the fact that some may claim that these claims of exclusivity are dangerous? And that is to love and to serve just as Jesus loves and serves. Religious belief's not the problem. Enforced atheism killed millions in the 20th and 21st centuries. All believing the exact same thing is not the solution. The solution is serving others. So I want to ask some questions that Keller here was asked. I'm not going to answer them all, but I want to present them to us. He said one of the things that came out of this discussion was that all major religions are equally valid and basically teach the same thing. That only an extremist would believe that there are, and this is quotes, inferior religions. In other words, that what they say, the doctrinal differences are minor and insignificant. That God is essentially just an all-loving spirit out there, looking out for us, caring. But history doesn't allow for that. I mean, Buddhism, there is no personal God. Islam cannot be reduced to love, but instead to obedience. The insistence on what they call no doctrine, which they define as the things that separate us, is in itself a doctrine, isn't it? If you say, well, there's no difference, that's claiming a certain part of truth. That's holding that belief as superior to other people's belief. I mean, it's falling into the same danger that they're accusing us of falling into. Or how about this? Each religion sees part of spiritual truth, but none can see the whole truth. It's the old illustration that if you've got a bunch of blind people in a room with an elephant and all start touching the elephant, I mean, some will think it's a tree because it's big legs. Some will think it's like a snake because there's a trunk. That all just see a part of truth. The one who's telling that story is not blind. Someone has to see the whole elephant to make that judgment. And those making this claim that we don't see the whole truth are making the claim that they do. How about this? Religious belief is too culturally and historically conditioned to be true. In other words, the only reason we believe what we believe is because of the culture we live in. That if you were born in Turkey and you were raised in a Turkish background, you would be Muslim. Just if you're raised here, well, you're going to be Christian. It's all about culture. It's all about a cultural background. And that the only reason that I'm Christian is because I was born here. And I agree that culture plays a major role, unfortunately, in our religious beliefs. Sometimes we get stuck in what is culture and what is truth. And that is something we need to work on. But if it's all about culture, then why in China are millions and millions coming to Christ? Why is there a revival going on in Iran? A nation of great oppression and hatred of Christianity. Why are people coming to Christ in those areas if it's just about culture? Or they make the argument, it is arrogant to insist your religion is right and convert others to it. This last week, a week and a bit, it's been on the news a lot about this case in India where a woman was brutally raped until Her injuries were so bad she died. And there's been great outrage around the world, including by some of those who say, well, you know, it's arrogant to insist that you're right. And it's all cultural anyways, so let people live their... I don't know about you, but if that's how we live and say, well, in that corner of the world, rape is allowed? Really? When we were in Africa, we kept hearing stories about how slavery continues to be prevalent in Africa. And yes, culturally it has been accepted for thousands of years. So does that make it right there? Is slavery all right in certain parts of the world? No, we try to convert people from that. If something's right, we stand up for what's right. We stand up for what's right. Others have argued, and this is the second point on the outline that you find in the back of the bulletin. Well, hey, okay. Jesus came and did some good things, but isn't he just one among many giants? Isn't he just one of? Many religions have influenced world history. Okay? Some of them have disappeared, some of them may not be true, but is Jesus the right way to go? Reading this week of one atheist who made the argument that everybody's an atheist, just some of us fall short by one God. We reject many others, but we claim to accept one. There was a gentleman by the name of Blaise Pascal. He was a famous philosopher back in the 1600s. And he made the argument that for thousands of years, humanity has employed great intelligence and efforts to all solve the same basic problems. We want to live in peace. We want to live in harmony. We want to raise our families well. We want to live lives that have a certain amount of significance. And if we've employed this much effort and intelligence for all this time, why have we not yet achieved it? Why have we not yet achieved it? Why, and these are his words, is the pursuit of happiness still just a pursuit? Why is the pursuit of happiness still just a pursuit? You read some of the leading atheists today, they'll argue that it's all about ignorance. Not that they have all the answers, but they've still things to learn. And if we can educate enough, we'll solve all the world's problems. Pascal disagreed with that. Now, he agreed that we needed to educate. And I agree with that too. We need more education. Education does solve a lot of our world's problems, but it doesn't solve the heart of one problem. Pascal made the argument that we have something in our world called evil. Sometimes we call it sin. And education does not solve the problem that there is base evil in our lives. He made the argument that we're at the same time, and these are his words, heroic and wretched. Heroic and wretched. We are noble and wonderful, but also plot horrible actions unworthy of the lowest animal. Education can teach us that we are wrong. Education can teach us that we are wrong. You know what? Every major religion in the world agrees with this. We all agree that there's a problem. It was Charles Darwin who argued that we are closer to beasts than we are to angels. And so, all the major religions of the world have tried to come up with codes, commandments, instructions, all meant to raise us up. There's an author that I really quite enjoy. He's a Christian philosopher named Dinesh D'Souza. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I've heard him say it, and he says it with an Indian accent. He lives in the United States, but he's originally from India. And he said this: religion in general is man's strategic manual for how to reach God. And then he goes on to say something that some of you have probably heard before, and I think he's bang on right. If this is the definition, that religion in general is man's strategic manual for how to reach God, then by definition, Christianity is not a religion. Christianity, by definition, is not a religion. Why would that be? Because we agree the man cannot do it. God must come down and fix our problems. Hinduism and Buddhism all teach that we need to confront ourselves, that we need to eliminate ourselves, because existence in its very self is suffering. We must learn to not care about anything in life, not care about what's going on around us, not worry about ourselves, to become almost distant, to become nothing, to disassociate and become distant from desire and life itself. Judaism, Islam, both teach about rules of codes and conduct. In Islam, there are 5 basic tenets to the faith. You pray 5 times a day. If you go to Mecca once during your life, if you recite the creed about Allah and Muhammad, if you give alms to the poor, if you take part in the fasting season of Ramadan, you please God. And then on top of that, you add on certain dietary restrictions, some codes of conduct. If you live by this, well, maybe you can make God happy enough. We, of course, claim roots in Judaism. But it's very similar, that if you follow the rules, the feasts, the ceremonies, God as judge will decide who makes it and who is good enough. So what's the standard? Christianity comes along and adopts the Jewish code and says it's impossible. Famous, recently deceased author Christopher Hitchens, who lived in a great hatred of Christianity, and yet who has a son now who's an evangelist. He wrote, "If God wanted such a high standard, he should have taken more care to invent a different species." And he says it with a great deal of cynicism. But you know what? He's quite correct. He's right. It's an impossible standard. But we have hope that Christianity is different, that it's not about a creed, it's not about a code, it's not about a way of life, it is about Jesus. No other figure in history is like Jesus. There's only one way. I've talked about quite a few books so far this morning, but how about one that I haven't talked about? And that's the most important of all, and that's the Bible. John 14, verse 6. It's not just up here. We put it on our wall all the time. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me." This is a unique view that allows for no other options. It is not my good efforts that make me good enough for God. It is not my best. It is not following a creed. It is not education. It is not leaving behind all desire. Jesus is the only way to God. Is this claim of exclusivity, is it dangerous? When Christianity was born, it was born in the era of the Greeks and the Romans. An era of millions of gods. They didn't know them all. They knew there were lots of gods out there, though. They believed in this, that, and the next thing. They weren't exclusive. In fact, they did persecute Christianity because they claimed to be exclusive, but they actually invited. They wanted to put statues of Jesus up with all the other statues. And in the midst of all that diversity and acceptance, it was a time of brutal warfare, where women were treated as objects simply for the sake of childbirth, where the poor were exploited for one's own selfish good. It was all about self. And Jesus came along and he said, I am the only way. That the one truth is that Jesus died in service for others. And there was a revolution. There were women who were given the right to life and considered human and given rights. The end to forced marriages. The early church pushed help to the poor, help to the sick, and cared for the widow and for the orphan, and put others first. Exclusivity did that. Yes, in the Middle Ages, things went really off the rails, and things went wrong. But Christianity, with peace and love and sacrifice, at its very heart, was different. Later in the Middle Ages, the church, probably at its very worst, came over to the New World. And when the Aztecs, who practiced human sacrifice, were confronted by the truths of Jesus, one Mexican historian wrote this: in a universe accustomed to seeing men sacrifice to the gods, nothing amazed the Indians more than the sight of a God who sacrificed himself for me. That made all the difference. Christopher Hitchens, again, the recently deceased evangelist for the atheist cause, wrote this: it would be horrible if it were true that we were designed and then created and then continually supervised throughout all our lives, waking and sleeping, and then continue to be supervised after our deaths. If that were true, it would be horrible. It would be like living in a celestial North Korea. You can't defect from North Korea, but at least you can die. With monotheism, they won't let you die and get away from them. Who wants that to be true? He doesn't know, but he said a powerful truth in there. He said a powerful truth. Jesus comes along and he says, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. And he makes this important claim, not just that no man comes to the Father except through me, but that there is a way to the Father. And it is through Jesus. Dinesh D'Souza, the guy I quoted earlier, the Indian-American philosopher, said this in response to Christopher Hitchens. The atheist basically wants to shut himself off from God. And I'm going to say, this doesn't just apply to atheists. This applies to those who are followers of Islam and all other religions. The atheist basically wants to shut himself off from God, or we can say from the true God, Jesus. And this helps us see why heaven is not closed to atheists. Nor is hell the fiery pit into which atheists are flung for their misdeeds. Heaven is God's domain where he is eternally present. Hell is where God is eternally absent. God does not reject the atheist rejects God. God does not dispatch the atheist to hell. The atheist wishes to close his eyes and his heart to God, and God reluctantly grants him his wish. In a sense, the gates to hell are locked from the inside. The Bible says that salvation is the gift of God. Many people, even many Christians, understand this to mean that God is offering us salvation as a gift. But But the Bible does not say that salvation is the gift from God. Rather, it says that salvation is the gift of God. Catch that, huh? The gift from God, the gift of God. God Himself is the gift. Heaven is best understood not as a place, but as a description of what it is like to be with God. To be with God requires that we want to be with Him, that we accept His presence of Himself. Jesus can get up and say that no man comes to the Father except through me, because He knows that there are many who do not want to go that path. It's not that God designed us that way. But many can make a choice to go a different way. But Jesus comes along. And He comes with what sounds absurd and sometimes even offensive. Do you know what? Yeah, we have evil in our world. We have sin in our world. We have things that are going wrong. And it's so unfortunate. It's really tragic. And none of us, not one of us, can fix the problems on our own. I can't do it. Some may claim it's education. You know what? I have lots of university knowledge. I went for 8 years. The wrong of my life didn't get educated out of me. I work hard to try to be the best person I can be. There's still things in my life that are wrong. I got one hope, and that's forgiveness. Only one hope, and that's the forgiveness of Jesus. The acceptance of, yes, I have a lot wrong with me. That I need God. I need a Savior. I need hope. I don't need to work harder. I don't need to try harder. I don't need to try to think myself into a state of non-existence. I need to know Jesus. Because Jesus is the way. Jesus is the truth. Jesus is the life. And no man comes to the Father except